So cerebellum. To talk about the cerebellum in one class, it seems to be difficult. And even if you think of the two classes, still it is difficult. But as time is very short, so we have to think to discuss about the cerebellum, and we'll discuss today the cerebellum considering one important point, that gross areas, basic areas, all of you know, all of us know. So considering this, we'll discuss cerebellum on the special points, on salient points. Cerebellum, which is, if you consider that introduction, little brain. Cerebellum is known as little brain or small brain. As because in the initial phase of evolution, we have seen the cerebellum, and which was very small, only small component. Even in human cerebellum, in human brain, cerebellum covers only 10% of the weight of cerebrum, which is the main brain. Though it is so, but the cerebellum, interesting thing is that, has covered the crossroads, has passed through the crossroads of long evolutionary life, and thereby cerebellum ultimately acquired the 50% of the surface area as compared to that of the cerebrum. Means cortical gray matter surface area of the cerebellum covers is equal to 50% of the surface area of the cerebrum. Number one. And number two is that this cerebellum, and which is not truly concerned with the initiation of the voluntary movements, but cerebellum is that part of the brain and which acts like the trainer of a musical troupe, just working or acting behind the scene, because you know that cerebrum concerned with the command of the initiation of the voluntary movements of the body, but to direct this voluntary movement in right direction, and number two, to the proper extent, and number three is that movement should be very fine and skilled for the economy of the muscular force. So just optimum muscular force. So cerebellum acting as a trainer of the musical troupe, who controls hundreds of musicians from behind the scene and is concerned with the regulation of number one, that is movement in proper direction, muscular activity or motor action to the proper extent, and with the economy of the force of the muscle contraction, means optimum muscle contraction. And these occurs through what? 1, 2, 3. Number one is that it occurs through maintenance of the muscle tone. Number two, that is maintenance of equilibrium of the body or balance. Rather, in order, it should be the maintenance of the equilibrium and the maintenance of the muscle tone and coordination of the muscle movement. This cerebellum has got principle of action. So next salient points will be talking about the principle of action. Principle of action of cerebellum in three phases. 1, 2, 3. Number one, reception. Number one, reception. Number two, that is integration. Integration. Number three, regulation. To clarify these basic words, I repeat to say that as cerebellum is acting as a trainer of the musical troupe from behind the scene, therefore this cerebellum, what it does, it is not concerned with the initiation of the voluntary movements of the body, but this cerebellum is for regulation of the voluntary actions of the muscles in number one, proper direction to the optimum range, that means adequate range. Number three, that is economy of the muscle force. 1, 2, 3. Through coordination of the muscle activity. Reception. First, what is that? Various kind of sensory inputs. And these peripheral sensory inputs, which are of what kinds? Of what kinds? That is somatic afferent, proprioceptive, exteroceptive, and that is general somatic afferent. This is special somatic afferent. We will divide that proprioceptive and exteroceptive. So we are talking about the principle of action of the principle of function or action of the cerebellum. Number one, reception of the inputs. Cerebellum receives various kinds of the sensory inputs. Inputs are four kinds. 1, 2, 3, 4. General somatic afferent proprioceptive, from the muscles, from the tendons, from the joints. General somatic afferent exteroceptive. Don't forget this. We never think about this in case of cerebellum, touch and pressure, particularly the pressure. Next, special somatic afferent, proprioceptive, sense of vibration. Where from? That is from vestibular apparatus. And exteroceptive, that is, these are two, sense of hearing, cochlear sensation, cochlear apparatus, organ of cortic, and sense of vision from the photoreceptors of the retina of the eye. So 1, 2, 3, 4, source of the inputs. Next, how it is received? 4 are their sources. How it is received? It is received by 3 ways or through 3 ways. Through 3 ways, 3 different groups of afferents. One is ascending afferents, one is horizontal afferents, one is descending afferents. Ascending afferents from spinal cord, spinocerebellar. Spinocerebellar means spinocerebellar ventral, dorsal, and also cuneo-cerebellar, and also it is to be noted spino-olivocerebellar. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inputs. Ascending afferents. Horizontal afferents from vestibular nucleus, vestibulocerebellar. Descending afferents to the cerebellum, descending inputs, cortex, cerebral cortex, corticopontocerebellar, corticopontocerebellar. These inputs, important point is that inputs from the cerebral cortex, if you think of this total of this descending afferent inputs, it is what? That is spinothalamo-cortical, then corticopontocerebellar pathway. Total pathway is this, sensory inputs, because the sensory input is to be received from this, all the areas of the body, not from above. So this is inputs, reception. These are integrated. After integration, what happens? It is analyzed, integrated, and finally what? Direction is given by the cerebellum for regulation. Finally for the regulation. Regulation for what? Regulation for the proper muscular activities, for proper muscular activities in reference to the maintenance of the equilibrium of the body, postural adjustment of the body, along with the maintenance of the muscle tone and also coordination of the muscle movement. 1, 2, 3. That is for number 1, that is maintenance of the balance. Number 2, that is maintenance of the muscle tone. Together these two for the postural adjustment of the body. And number 3, that is coordination of the muscle movements. So that movement should be smooth, skilled and precise as per the desire, not beyond that. Means therefore, this movement should be, I told the 3 important basic points. One is proper direction, to proper range, direction, range and economy of the muscle force. That means optimum muscle contraction, not more than that, not less than that. Optimum. So this is principle of action. After that, important point, that phylogenetic classification. Phylogenetic classification. Phylogenetic classification. Cerebellum is subdivided phylogenetically into 3 components. 1, 2, 3. Archicerebellum, archicerebellum, paleocerebellum, paleocerebellum, neocerebellum. Archicerebellum, paleocerebellum, neocerebellum. All these we'll discuss in reference to 1, 2, 3, 4 criteria. Number 1, evolution. Number 2, composition. Composition. Number 3, connection, to which it is connected. And number 4, basic function. Just for your information, we read from the book in the descriptive fashion. You teach the students, but if you think about the points, salient points, on which points you agree, just discuss, it will be easier to remember and also deliver to the students. See, cerebellum, archicerebellum, paleocerebellum, neocerebellum, in reference to evolution, composition, connection, basic function. Archicerebellum, it is the most primitive cerebellum. And archicerebellum was found in 3 vertebrates. And archicerebellum was found in case of the fishes, amphibians. Number 1. Number 2, composition. If we come to the human brain, because it is amalgamated with the other 2 cerebellum later on. So human brain, that is archicerebellum, blue. This is superior cerebellum. This is superior cerebellum, means the superior aspect of the cerebellum. This is showing inferior cerebellum. From inferior surface, antero-posterior. Antero-posterior. So inferior cerebellum. So blue, archicerebellum. In superior cerebellum, lingula. This is lingula. And flocculonodular. Lingula and flocculonodular of inferior cerebellum. Means therefore it is the rostralmost part in full form cerebellum. And this archicerebellum After this it is connection, connected to vestibular nucleus. So it is connected to vestibular nucleus. Function, basic function, equilibrium. 1, 2, 3, 4. Paleo-cerebellum, anterior lobe. Anterior lobe of cerebellum except lingular. Means what? Culmen and ala of this ala, and your central lobule and ala, and culmen at this is lateral extension is known as anterior quadrangular lobule. Suppose if you just forget to tell about the detail, you can specify in this classification as such, that is anterior lobe minus lingular plus part of the posterior lobe, that is only vermis portion, pyramid and uvula. So pyramid and uvula, that is paleo-cerebellum. Composition, connection, spinal cord. Connection, spinal cord. Connected to the spinal cord and concerned with what function? That is maintenance of the muscle tone for postural adjustment. Neocerebellum, evolution. That is, it is present in the higher mammals, including the human brain, full formed, fully developed, and this is composed of remaining part of the all other areas of the cerebellum. Connected to cortex. So it is connected to the cerebral cortex. For what function? Coordination of the muscle movement. Coordination of the muscle movement for what? Coordination of the muscle movement. Again, same 3 points. The movements must be in proper extent, proper direction, with the economy of the muscle force. That means optimum muscle contraction, so that it should be skilled and smooth. So that is phylogenetic classification. After phylogenetic classification, we will pass on to that is important area of the cerebellum, that is structure of the cerebellum. Internal structure of cerebellum. First important point is that how we will just think of to deliver the lecture in case of, or how you will remember, or how you will write in your examination, structure of the cerebellum. First, basic important point of the structure of the cerebellum is that is general plan, internal structure. Internal structure. First is general plan. We know that cerebellum basically is composed of outer cortex, grey matter, and inner medullary substance, white matter. Number 1. And this outer cortex, which has got different layers. Outer cortex has the different layers, and what are the layers we will come to discuss in connection with the structure of the cortex. So we will come to individual discussion of the structure of the cortex. Medulla. So number 1, that is cortex, cortical grey matter, cortical grey matter. Number 2, deep white matter. White matter. This white matter is composed of the fibers, and these fibers are of 2 types: intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic means the fibers which are restricted within the cerebellum inside. That means connection between the neurons, various kind of the neurons of the cerebellum itself, within it, in the cortex. Extrinsic fibers either coming in or going out. Means fibers are afferents and efferents. This medulla, white matter, we know that this white matter, and which is, we have seen that in your practical class, you have seen the sections of the cerebellum. White matter and which is gradually narrows toward the surface of the cortex like the branches of the tree, which is typically described as arbor vitae cerebelli. And on the apical end of this arbor vitae branches of the tree, there is superimposition of the leaflets or the folia of the cerebellar cortex. But in the deeper part of the white matter, embedded are the nuclei, coronal section of the cerebellum, and where it shows the nuclei in the medullary part or interior of the cerebellum. So, which are known as the cerebellar nuclei. Next important point is that before we pass on to discuss the structure of the cerebellar cortex, important point that correlation of structure with function. Correlation of structure with function of cerebellum. What is that? If we understand this basic thing, then it will be easier to study the detail of the structure of the cerebellar cortex. Correlation of the structure with the function. For that, you have to know that it is the Purkinje cell. It is the Purkinje cell of cerebellum. Purkinje cell of the cerebellum, which are the pivot lying in the center of gravity of the structure of the cerebellum. Purkinje cells are the pivot or lying in the center of gravity of the internal structure of the whole cerebellum. And this Purkinje cell continuously round the clock all the times receive, these cells receive always excitation input from different sources. How it receives? Purkinje cell lies inside the cerebellum, so how it receives? It receives obviously by the afferent inputs, means afferent connections, means afferent fibers. These afferent inputs, Purkinje cells, which are of two different kinds. So this is Purkinje cell afferent direct and indirect. Inside the cerebellum, assisting cells are many to the Purkinje cells. Granule cells are there. So, these are direct afferents. These are indirect afferents. Through granule cell, it is passing on to the Purkinje cell. So, these fibers, which are directly entering the Purkinje cells, which are only one of so many kinds of afferent fibers. We know the cerebellum is connected by three cerebellar peduncles to three different components of the brainstem. All the three components of the brainstem, medulla pons and midbrain, connected by inferior, middle and superior cerebellar peduncle, all are having afferent fibers. Though middle one is not having any efferent fibers, exclusively the afferent fibers. So afferent fibers are going through all this. And if you remember the list of the components of the afferent fibers of inferior cerebellar peduncle, I will be coming later on if time permits. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. means 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. Besides this, there are other afferents in other cerebellar peduncle. So all afferents, among all afferents, this is only the afferent which is spino in bracket olivo cerebellum. Spino olivo cerebellum. This is direct afferents. All other afferents are through the interruption through the interneurons, that is granule cells. So these are all other afferents. All other afferent. Okay. Next, what happens? Purkinje cell, which has got the long axon, which is a Golgi type 1 type of neuron structurally, with the shorter dendrites and long, very long axon, Golgi type 1. So this Purkinje cell, and which sends axon, and it sends axon to cerebellar nuclei in the white matter. Cerebellar nuclei. And from cerebellar nuclei, various nuclei there, they are axon leaving the cerebellum as efferent fibers, which come out through 2 out of 3 cerebellar peduncles, namely the inferior and superior cerebellar peduncle, sparing the middle one. Okay. So this is efferent. This is efferent fibers from cerebellum. Efferent fibers. Why it does? Various efferents are there. Efferents will be going all these different directions from different nuclei. And as you see, just quickly, if you correlate, this will be efferent fibers. You see these fibers which are coming out in 3 groups. And 3 groups means if you go from below upwards, group to the vestibular-nuclear connection. And this is cerebello-rubral, means cerebello-rubro-spinal connection to the spinal cord. 1 vestibular, 2 spinal, cerebello-rubro-spinal. 3, that is cerebellum, means directly from dentate nucleus. So dentato, this is called dentato-thalamocortical. So different divergent efferents are there. Among these, there are some of the efferent fibers from the Purkinje cell, which without relying in the cerebellar nuclei, they are further longer, more long axon coming out of the cerebellum directly as the efferents. So some of the Purkinje cells axon without relying in the, this is the basic, it will be clear, this diagram will be clear later on. So this will be directly passing out to the cerebellum. Which one? It will be passing to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Where from? It will be passing from the nucleus, not directly from the Purkinje cells, and this is directly called, that is cerebello-vestibular fibers, not through the nucleus. Cerebello-vestibular means going to where? Vestibular nucleus. But this vestibular nucleus has also received the efferents beforehand I have told. That is one category, that is from vestigial nucleus to the vestibular nucleus. Vestigio-vestibular. So apart from these, there are another group of incoming vestibular nucleus fibers. These are directly cerebello-vestibular, means directly from the Purkinje cells. The important point is that this is always excited. This is excited cell is inhibited from the cortex, from 2 different layers of the cortex by the 2 kinds of the cells. In the layer, upper layer, that is, this is the stellate cell, And another is that basket cell. This is basket cells. Stellate cell and basket cell. This you know what is that? This is giving rise to inhibitory whip. It is giving rise to inhibitory whip. So it gives rise to the inhibitory whip to these Purkinje cells. Two cells from the superficial layer, which is called molecular layer, and one cell that is deeper layer, the granular layer, and therefrom another cell, and which is known as Golgi cell. This is Golgi cells. And it also gives inhibitory whip to this Purkinje cells. So this is what excitation of Purkinje cell, so ultimately excitation of the cerebellar nuclei, continuously excited as per the desire for what? As per the desire for movement, proper direction, optimum range, economy of the muscle force. For that, whip is required by these three different kinds of cells. All these three cells are therefore gives rise to whipping, which is inhibitory whipping on the Purkinje cells. So this is structural and functional correlation. With this structure of the cortex, come to this diagram, structure of the cortex. We see therefore the structure of the cortex here. Very quickly, as we know that this is the cortex, this is the medulla or the white matter. So this part is the cortex from superficial to deep, molecular layer, Purkinje cell layer, granular layer. What do we describe? How we teach? How we read from the book? We read from the book that conventional reading or conventional teaching is that we discuss or read or tell the students superficial to deep. Molecular layer, we finish molecular layer, then we go to Purkinje layer, and then we go to the granular layer. But I will tell in different way. I will tell first, it is clear to all of us that three different layers contains what kind of cells. But just very quickly, that is molecular layer composed of three cells. The molecular layer composed of two cells, that is stellate cell and basket cell. Purkinje cell layer, one kind of cell, single row of Purkinje cell. Here is the fallacy, single row of Purkinje cell body. It is Purkinje cell layer is made up of cell body. Means that still Purkinje cell spans for all the three layers of the cortex. Body is in the Purkinje cell layer, dendrite is in the molecular layer, axon is in the deeper granular layer and also in the middle. So we'll discuss, and deeper layer composed of two kind of cells. That is the one is that is granule cell and Golgi cell. This is granule cell and Golgi cell. So we see that first is Purkinje cell. Cell body of Purkinje cell, which are that is soma of the Purkinje cell, which occupies in a single row along the long axis of the Purkinje cell layer. It is a large flush-shaped cell body, wherefrom it is having the dendrite, and dendrite is like the tree bush, and which proceeds towards the superficial molecular layer, and this tree bush which is having the branchings, and from the basal side there is the long axon which is passing beyond the granular layer to the white matter, most of them which relay in the cerebellar nuclei. This Purkinje cell and which has got relation with the different fibers. What you see that? When we discuss the cell, we will have to pass on to the fibers for easy understanding. If you see the green fibers, these are green fibers which are the one type of the afferent fibers. And what type of the afferent fibers? They are called climbing fibers. And these climbing fibers which are, that is afferent fibers, which extends from these because it enters the medulla through the, medulla means white matter, through the peduncles, afferent of the cerebellum. Through what? All the three layers, three peduncles. Then from the medulla it is passed further superficially up to the surface, long enough, and which climbs like a vine on a tree. You have seen many big trees, large trees, long trees. What there lies vine on the surface of the, on the branches of the tree. So these fibers look like vine, vine on a tree, and this is why these are known as the climbing fibers. These are afferents. What afferents? These are the afferents which are only one group of the fibers. One group of the fibers. That is, there are many afferents. One group of the fibers, that is olivocerebellar fibers. Means actual fibers are, that is spino-olivocerebellar fibers, carrying the inputs from the receptors, spino and the bracket, olivocerebellar fibers which pass through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Beside this, all other fibers are all other afferent fibers. Afferent inferior cerebral peduncle, afferent middle cerebral peduncle, pontocerebellar fiber, afferent to the superior cerebellar peduncle, all are these kind of the fibers. These are called mossy fibers. Mossy fibers, why? Because when these fibers enter where? From the medulla, means from the white matter, core of the white matter, to the deeper granular layer, they divide into a number of thin branchlets. So looks like the mossy appearance, so that is why they are called the mossy fibers. And many branchlets are there. One mossy fiber, afferent fiber, mossy fiber has got many branchlets. And these many branchlets, which are individually, one of the branchlets I have shown, these are to the granule cells. I have not labeled properly. That is, these are granule cells. You can label these. This is granule cells. Granule cells. So these fibers, filaments, just relate with these granule cells. And they relate with these granule cells with the dendrites of the granule cells. And when they relate the dendrites of the granule cells, they form the synaptic connection. End of the granule cell shows that is expansion, and which are synapsing with this termination of these mossy fibers. So incoming fibers are of two kinds. Next we pass on to the other cell. Next we discuss the interneurons. After this, interneurons. After Purkinje cells, interneurons. Interneurons are of 1, 2, 3. Three different kinds. Interneurons of molecular layer, interneuron of granular layer, and what is that? Will be singulator. Interneuron of molecular layer. Molecular layer shows two different kinds of cells, that is stellate cell and basket cell. Stellate cells are star-shaped, more superficially placed. Basket cells are in the deeper part of the molecular layer. Stellate cells are so called because star-shaped, small sized. Their axon arborized with this dendritic spine of what? That is Purkinje cells. For your information, dendritic tree, like the tree bush, It's got three different phases of branchlets: primary, secondary, tertiary. So tertiary phase stage goes the dendritic spines. So with the dendritic spines, so many things, that is with different kinds of cells. Apart from the afferent fibers, we see that there it relates via axons of this stellate cell and basket cell. But basket cell were the long axon which forms the basket by the free terminals, free branchings, which holds the, as a basket, holds the flux separate cell body of the Purkinje cell, soma of the Purkinje cell, and their synapse just at the proximal end of the axon. Further beyond, in the basal part of the axon, which is known as the pre-axon, where the basket cells relays. Two are there: granular layer, granule cells, which are the main cells in the granular layer, and why they are so called, it is known to all of you. Plenty of cells, that is, this layer is densely packed with the small sized cells with the scanty cytoplasm and very prominent nuclei, which is number of dots, and in stain, in histological appearance, this gives the granular appearance of this layer. So that is why it is called granule cells. This granule cells has got 4 to 5 dendrites, and it has got the axons. This is one kind of interneuron in the granular layer, and these dendrites which receive all other afferents excepting spino-olivocerebellar fibers. And there, in this synaptic connection, there is another interneuron, that is Golgi cell. And this Golgi cell has got the axon. Their dendrites are arborized in the superficial layer of the cortex, Purkinje cell, and also molecular layer. But this axon which forms here, that is, joins with the synapse between these mossy fibers and the granule cells to give appearance to the cluster-like appearance which is known as glomerulus. So that is glomerulus. I told the basic function. It is already clear that these are also the whip cells, inhibitory cells, acting as forming this inhibitory whip on the excitatory impulse of what? Granule cells, which are conferred just to this ultimately by their axon to the dendrites of the Purkinje cells, which divide in the T-shaped manner, and plenty of fibers with just filling up whole of the molecular layer, and these ultimately known as the parallel fibers will form the synapse with the dendrites of the Purkinje cells. So these layers of cells are there which have got specific function. And third type of the cells. There are two other type of cells. In recent days it is called, and these cells, number one is that, suppose this is Purkinje cell, this is Purkinje cell, cell body and the dendrites, axon is there passing. There is one kind of cell which are known as Lugaro cells. They are known as Lugaro cells. And these cells are intermediate in between granule cells. This is, which is passing like this. So there is a cell which is in between. These cells are interneurons between these granule cells and the Purkinje cells, and which are having also the inhibitory action on the Purkinje cell. Another type of cell are there, and which is another type of cell is there. This is here the granule cell, and these cells, between this granule cell and the fiber, as you see here, dendrites of the granule cell, and here the mossy fiber. So this is the junction between these two. So there is another type of cell here, which is unipolar cell. unipolar cell which is between the granule cell and there is mossy fiber laying here. So this is which are known as brush cells. These are known as brush cells. So these are also the recent interneurons found between this Purkinje cell and other interneurons, that is Golgi cells. Cells after this, white matter. And before this, we pass on to this white matter. After we discuss the white matter, then we'll pass on to the circuit. White matter, you know that, which I told that it is made up of two kinds, intrinsic and extrinsic. You think of the intrinsic fibers within the cerebellar cortex inside, and extrinsic fibers are the afferent and efferent fibers of the cerebellum, and these extrinsic fibers which are just afferent and efferents passing through the different cerebellar peduncles. So conventionally when you teach the students, particularly undergraduate students, even in the postgraduate students, in viva examination it is asked components of the cerebellar peduncles. So you know that inferior cerebellar peduncle composed of both afferent, efferent, and middle cerebellar peduncle only afferent, ontocerebellar fiber. Superior cerebellar peduncle also afferent and efferents. You see that inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is composed of afferent fibers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Number 1, dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Number 1, afferents. We are talking about the afferents. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Next is anterior and posterior external arcuate fibers. Very quickly, you remember, recapitulate. Anterior and posterior external arcuate fibers. Anterior external arcuate fibers are the axon arising from arcuate nucleus. You know the position of the arcuate nucleus, lying on the ventral aspect of the pyramid in the medulla, whereupon the fibers are just form a arcuate course, arch course, to approach the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Through this it goes to the cerebellum. Anterior external arcuate. We have discussed ascending tracts in previous class, and there we have discussed there is a tract passing to the posterior funiculus, posterior column. This is known as spino-cuneo-cerebellar tract. Spino-cerebellar-cuneo tract, which carries the impulse proprioceptive insertion and sensation above the level of the first thoracic, above the level of Clark's column of cell. And these fibers are passing through this, through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and this before that it could go over accessory cuneate nucleus, superolateral to the cuneate nucleus, or lateral cuneate nucleus is called, and this is ultimately passing to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Anterior and posterior external arcuate fibers. Next is that two tracts are there, that is 1, 2, 3 anterior, posterior external arcuate fibers, and next is that 4, 5 which are parolivocerebellar tract, parolivocerebellar tract and olivocerebellar tract. Olivocerebellar tract. Olivocerebellar tract extends from inferior olivary nucleus. Parolivocerebellar tract extends from, that is, medial and superior accessory olivary nucleus. So this is from accessory olivary nucleus. Main nucleus is the inferior olivary nucleus. So this is parolivo and olivo. Parolivo, why before? Why olivolateral? Then after that, this is reticulocerebellar, and this is vestibulocerebellar. Reticulocerebellar and vestibulocerebellar tract. Because efferents, then it will be easy to remember. If you take up the last three from below upwards and reverse it, that will be the efferent fibers. Clear? That is technique of remembering, technique of telling the students regarding this formula, that these three, you reverse it, efferent tracts present in the inferior peduncle are this. So these are cerebello-olivary, cerebello-reticular, cerebello-vestibular. Quickly, middle cerebellar peduncle, only afferents, thickest, bulkiest, maximum fibers, that is cortex from cortex, pontine nucleus on the other side, so cortico-pontocerebellar side, fibers. Superior cerebellar peduncle, afferent, efferent. Afferent easy to remember, other spinocerebellar tract, ventral spinocerebellar tract. After crossing for the second time in the midbrain, then goes to the same side of the cerebellar hemisphere. So one is that. Second is another important tract is that tectocerebellar tract. Tectocerebellar tract, important tricky questions is that these fibers are passing truly further medially through the white matter of superior medullary velum. You know superior medullary velum connecting to superior cerebellar peduncle, thin layer of white matter. So sometime examiner asks in oral examination, what are the fibers present in the superior medullary velum? These are the tectocerebellar. Number 1 point to remember. Second point to remember is that these tectocerebellar fibers are in the pathway of what? Spinotectocerebellar fibers. Spinotectocerebellar fibers are required for what? I told that integration which is in relation to what? Perception received from where? That is received from what? That is the vision and also the organ of hearing. They pass to the tectum by this brachium and these two brachia, superior and inferior brachia. So from where the inputs are cutting that spinotectal tract, and these fibers is adjusted by the inputs carried from the visual sensation and cochlear sensation. So this is tectocerebellar tract. Afferent, efferent fibers. Regarding the nucleus present in this white matter, nucleus, you know, these are four and which are D, E, F, G. So D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4 serially, dentate nucleus, emboliform nucleus. This is globus nucleus, fastigial nucleus. So you remember when you teach the students for remembering, because undergraduate students having the vast course, lot of load, so you will have to remember many things, but examiners will ask these questions. So this D, E, F, G, serially you tell D, E, F, G, you tell 1, 2, 4, 3, like that. You tell the students regarding the nucleus, you tell 1, 2, 4, 3. Order is 1, 2, 3, 4, but 1, 2, 4, 3. So these are four nuclei. Important point, very quickly I will be turning to that. These are cortex, this is the vermis, this is the lateral lobe of cerebellum. So this vermis has got the cortex, lateral lobe of the cerebellum has got the cortex. So this cortex is known as the vermal zone, and this is known as just adjacent to that medial one, median, medial, lateral. So this medial one, paravermal zone, and this is lateral zone. 3 zones. Nuclei are 4, where from? That is medial most, that is fastigial nucleus. Medial most is fastigial nucleus, elliptical, lying in the white matter of the vermal area, vermis, just adjacent to the midline, and this is the nucleus related to the archicerebellum. 2 other nuclei are emboliformis and globose nucleus, where one important point to note that globose nucleus are smaller, spherical, round or spherical, and they are duplicated sometimes. That is why I have drawn two nuclei here there. Sometimes they are duplicated, but these two nuclei belong to the paleocerebellum. Therefore, these two nuclei act together, connected, opposed together, interposed together. That is why they are called nucleus interpositus. And lateral to that, dentate nucleus. These are four nuclei divided into three groups: nucleus of archicerebellum, nucleus of paleocerebellum, nucleus interpositus, and nucleus of neocerebellum, dentate nucleus. So these are inputs from the cortex from three different zones. These arrows shows, and these are arrows coming out from your nucleus through the efferent fibers, 2-3 different groups, 1, 2, 3, for 3 different destinations, for 3 different purposes. 3 different destinations: dentato-thalamocortical. Next is interposito, that is rubral. So this is actually called cerebello-rubral. Interposito rubral, nucleus interpositus, 2 red nucleus, interposito or cerebello-rubrospinal. Cerebello-rubrospinal. And next is, that is what? This is one fastigious nucleus. From fastigious nucleus, fastigio-vestibular. Fastigio-vestibular. With this, very quickly we come on to this, that is circuit. So circuit, I think in 2 phases we have discussed the interconnection between the neurons. First we have discussed basically, that is basic correlation of the structure and the function. There we discussed, we have given the sketch. So with the sketch we have seen the main pivot cell is your Purkinje cell, and how it is connected by the efferents, how the efferent is going, and from efferent how they go to higher the dentate, you have the cerebellar nuclei, or directly as axon of this. As you see, this is axon of this. Finally, this is axon directly going to the cerebellovestibular fibers. These are only for the cerebellovestibular fibers, not relating to the nuclei. But there is what? That is, there is also fastigiovestibular. These are there. This is fastigiovestibular are there. Apart from this, from cerebellum, directly Purkinje cell axon also goes to the vestibular nucleus. So fastigiovestibular. So with this, we see that circuit afferent by this Purkinje cell receiving constant excitation inputs by the afferent fibers, either directly through the climbing fibers or indirectly by this excitatory cell, granule cell, as mossy fibers. All these are excitation to the Purkinje cell. This excitation phase of Purkinje cell is propagated through their axon, either through the nucleus, which are also the gives excitation impulse. So all these are excitatory, these are excitatory, but for these again 3 things, that is for balance, postural adjustment, maintenance of the muscle tone, and also the coordination of the muscle movements. Time to time whip, inhibitory whip is required. Inhibitory whip is required by these interneurons. Interneurons in different areas, in different phases of conduction. One is, that is interneurons here, 2 kinds of inhibitory interneurons, stellate cell and basket cell, and here it is a Golgi cell. Two different levels shows the inhibitory interneurons. Through this inhibitory whip, that is regulation of the cerebellar function participates, takes place. So by that, precise movement in proper direction, proper extent, it is possible with the proper range. To conclude, that is clinical anatomy important points. Only salient points will be coming to discuss because it will be very interesting. Number 1 thing is that cerebellar lesion has got some causes. So causes of cerebellar lesion. So first is cerebellar lesion, very, very important, and it will be very easy to understand the manifestations of cerebellar lesion. Manifestations of cerebellar lesion is very interesting and easy to understand if we think about the basic of the functions of the cerebellum. So through the functions of the cerebellum, understanding cerebellar lesion manifestations can easily be understood. And these lesions having the various causes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 1, that is traumatic, obvious. Number 2, ischemic. Ischemic cerebellar lesion is very common. That is because of the occlusion of the various cerebellar arteries, either superior cerebellar artery or the 2 inferior cerebellar arteries. So, ischemic, traumatic, ischemic, degenerative, neoplastic. Neoplastic disease of the cerebellum, which is known as the medulloblastoma. Medulloblastoma. Medulloblastoma is a slow-growing congenital cerebellar neoplasm just starting in the vermal area. If it is restricted to the vermal area, then it will give rise to the syndrome related to the lesion in the archicerebellum. So, cerebellar lesion leading to cerebellar syndrome is divided grossly into 2 basic types. One is archicerebellar syndrome. Why it is divided into 2? Because other lesions, vascular, degenerative or traumatic, these 2 are amalgamated. So all the parts of the cerebellum, phylogenetic cerebellum, are amalgamated lesion. But in case of medulloblastoma, specifically it affects the midline area, that vermal zone, giving rise to the Vermeer syndrome, that is archicerebellar syndrome. Or that is known as another group, that is neocerebellar syndrome. So in archicerebellar syndrome and neocerebellar syndrome. Archicerebellar syndrome, and this is related to that is disorder in the equilibrium. Disorder in the equilibrium gives rise to what? That is unsteadiness. 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 1, 2, 3. Unsteadiness of stance. Unsteadiness of stance. Unsteadiness of gait. And unsteadiness of the central part of the body, that is unsteadiness of the trunk. So that is head, neck, and trunk. Head, neck and trunk. Unsteadiness of the trunk. Unsteadiness in the stance. And you tell, an important point is that in this level, I want to emphasize the cerebellar syndrome, if it is chronic, long-standing, sometimes these syndromes are compensated by the action of the assistance of the function of other components of the nervous system. Why I will be telling that? That this cerebellar syndrome, archicerebellar unsteadiness in stance. So even when the eyes are steadiness in standing, so to compensate this, patient will stand with the 2 feet apart with a broad base. Stands with the broad base, and just for support of the body, for support of the balance, lower limb muscles will be over contracted. So over contraction of the lower limb muscles, this will be giving rise to stiffness of the legs. And if you ask to close the eyes, obviously in the dorsal column we have rest like that, it will give rise to what? Tendency to sway. So it will give rise to rhombic sign positive. So number 1, that is standing on the broad base. Number 2, stiffness of the lower limb muscles. Number 3, closing the eyes, rhombic sign positive. Unsteadiness in the stance. Unsteadiness in gait, style of walking, pattern of walking, gait. So in unsteadiness of gait, what will happen? Patient will be having the tendency to sway from side to side. Will have the tendency to maintain the balance because archicerebral syndrome feature will have the tendency to the sway from side to side, which is known as staggering gait. It is known as staggering gait. Number 3, and which is obvious, that is unsteadiness to hold the head. Globe of the head needs to be supported over the neck. So weight of the head and supported by the neck, particularly in case of medulloblastoma, in case of the children, it is very difficult to hold the head. So in case of children, it is obvious, it is difficulty to support the head over the neck. So it will just move from side to side or front to back. With the trunk will be when the person, the child will be standing even, there will be the tendency to just move the trunk forwards and backwards. So to and fro, forward and backward movement. So that is unsteadiness of the head, neck and the trunk. Next, neocerebellar syndrome, which is composed of what? That is disorder of paleocerebellum and disorder of neocerebellum. Disorder of paleocerebellum means what? Alteration in the muscle tone and the posture, and this muscle tone and the posture will give rise to what effect? That is loss of tone. Loss of tone will give rise to what is known as the asthenia. So muscle will be what? This muscle will be very loose. Elasticity or resilience will be lost. Loss of resilience. Muscle will be easily fatigued, and as the muscles will be easily fatigued, therefore it will be give rise to what? It will be easily tiredness of the muscle, will give rise to the laxity of the muscles. In addition to that, there will be the impairment in the stretch reflex. What impairment? Normally what happens? There is when there is a stretch reflex is elicited by elicitation of, say for example, knee jerk. What happens? Knee jerk give rise to what? Tapping of the tendon, that is the patella, ligamentum patellae. What will give rise to? That is brisk contraction of the quadriceps. Once it is brisk contraction, and this is just controlled, and then it is controlled by this antagonist, and then this will be brisk, after brisk contraction, this stops. But in case of what? Impairment of the regulation of the stretch reflex, as regulation is lost, what will happen? That is elicitation of the knee jerk will give rise to pendulation of the joint. So movement will go on, which is known as pendulous knee jerk. That is called pendulous knee jerk. Next, regarding this, the neocerebellar syndrome. Neocerebellar syndrome, and where they are give rise to the feature syndrome, and together which is known as cerebellar ataxia. It is known as cerebellar ataxia. This cerebellar ataxia is because of loss of regulation on the coordination of the muscle movement. It is basic thing is that impairment in the coordination. Impairment in the loss of regulation on coordination of the muscle movement. Coordination of the muscle movement called what? Again I told that what? That is range of movement, extent of movement, economy of the muscular contraction. So what will happen because of the incoordination? Number 1 is that, which is suppose normally there is not, but when a person intends to perform any fine skillful work means just to hold something, an object from with the hand to the fingers, to hold an object, or just buttoning the cloth, or writing with the help of the pen. So finer movements particularly affecting the hand and the fingers, where there will be in coordination, and this will give rise to the intention tremor. So this tremor is known as intention tremor, which is known as intention tremor. This is known as intention tremor. Number 2, I told that basic function of coordination is that if we abduct our limb, we know the range. If we ask to touch the tip of the nose with the index finger, tip of the index finger, we are aware of this, how much heavy it is. So extent, range, and also smooth, optimum force muscle control. Extent, range together, and smooth for optimum muscle contraction, so helps this. If all these three are affected, impaired, what will happen? Finger nose test will give rise to what? Person will not be aware of the extent of the movement, range of the movement, and also force of contraction of the muscles. So it will shake like this, either it will fall short of, or it will overshoot. So this is as known as that is finger nose test positive. So this is known as, the difficulty is known as, disability is known as dysmetria. Dysmetria. Dysmetria also correlated with the dyskinesia. Dyskinesia. Dysmetria is known as, which is related with the dyskinesia. Dyskinesia means that is incoordination of the agonist with the antagonist. Suppose smooth pronation and supination. This is smooth movement occurs because of the activity of the cerebellum, polishing of the movement. So polishing will not be there, so it will be occurring in the clumsy manner. So irregular, clumsy or haphazard manner, that is the example of the dysmetria, that is dyskinesia. So apart from this, there is another one which is known as nystagmus. Nystagmus. Nystagmus is nothing but the elicitation of what? Impaired function of the cerebellum in reference to the alteration in what? Coordination of agonist and antagonist. Suppose nystagmus, one object is moved from the center to the peripheral field of vision, and ask the patient to move the eyes. So peripherally means laterally, contraction of the lateral rectus, relaxation of the medial rectus. At the end of these, relaxation of the lateral rectus, and if you ask just fix the gauge, there will be sudden jerky movement or oscillations of the eyeball. Number 1, and because of this sudden oscillation, because in coordination of the function of medial rectus with the lateral rectus. So this is known as fixation nystagmus. So these are example of this in coordination in cerebellar disease. Thank you very much.